the other folks introduce themselves as well. So maybe we could start with Vinay.
Hi, everyone out there in Zoom land. I'm Vinay Pai. I lead engineering here at Bill.com. I've been here a little over 3 years, and the past dozen years or so, I've been working with SMBs and mid-market companies. I got my start way back in enterprise software and enterprise computing. The neat thing about this space is if you think about 20 years ago, the enterprise companies had access to all sorts of technology, all sorts of servers and things that they could install. But it was about 12, 14 years ago that the cloud has really made it possible for a lot of these advances and enterprise-grade technology, enterprise-grade security that we can actually deliver to SMBs and mid-market companies through the cloud. So these days, it's not only a very level playing field, but a lot of the things that we're doing in the cloud really result in a very secure, reliable, and efficient solution. So happy to talk with you about some of the things that we're doing to protect your most sensitive data.
That's great, Vinay. Thanks. Brian?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Yeah, my name is Brian Koref. I'm head of security for Sage Intacct. I've been with the company for about 6 years. I started with them back when they were Intacct prior to them being acquired by Sage. I've had probably 20 plus years cybersecurity. Started out in the military as a computer crime investigator and used that experience to transition into private sector. And I've held various individual contributor roles as security engineer and architect. Got into management about 15 years ago and have worked for fairly large companies such as KLA Tencourt, Informatica, now Sage Intacct, building and managing their security program.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian.
Sure.
Jeanine?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeanine Nosker. I'm the VP of Delivery Transformation here at Consero. I've been with Consero for 10 years now in various operational roles. And prior to Consero, sat in many of the accounting seats up to controller. So I'm kind of bringing to this discussion the view of the accountancy, controller, the user of the tools like Bill.com and Intacct, and how the additional security and technology has evolved and helped our lives in terms of protecting our companies and our clients' cash.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. That's always helpful to understand where folks have come from and what experiences they've had. I think we'll kind of jump into it now. We got a lot of things to cover. I think off the top, just largely here, we're obviously going to focus on cybersecurity and specifically how it relates to finance and accounting, making sure the funds of the business stay safe. Cash that leaves the business is for legitimate reasons. But I think we're all here because we understand the need for cybersecurity. Generally, some of us may have a better feel than others about what the real scenarios are, or the worst case scenarios for what happens when cybersecurity can't prevent attacks. And so maybe we could talk a little about, and I was thinking, Brian, maybe given your background, you could talk a little about what types of security breaches are middle market companies really the most susceptible to, where their cash and their money is at risk.
Sure. So when I think about mid-market, I actually think about Sage Intacct customers who are primarily small to medium-sized businesses. And one thing that I've noticed in that space, the small to medium-sized business space, is that many of these companies, they don't have someone like me, or they don't have security policies and security processes. A lot of companies, they're not thinking about security in the right manner. And so when I thought about that, when I think about that, there are certain types of breaches that are more paramount than others. And if I have to, I could probably rattle off 10 items, but the things that come to mind are, and there's no particular order. I would say number one is breaches that involve the compromise of internet-facing business systems. So these are things like your email or Salesforce, or if you're an AWS shop and you're using AWS to manage your infrastructure, that's another business application, believe it or not. Even Intacct, right? Intacct is an internet-facing business system, and whatever financial or accounting system you're using is typically an internet-facing business system, especially in this day and age where you're using SaaS businesses, you're not deploying huge infrastructure on-prem anymore. So that's the first one. The second one I would suggest is related to suppliers, the risks associated with suppliers, third-party software, and we've seen that, right? We know what SolarWinds looks like, or Code Cove if you've been exposed to that, Pulse Secure. We know what it looks like for one of your third parties to be compromised. Because if a third party is compromised, then what that means is that you're potentially compromised as well. Because if a third party is holding your data, then you have a breach. It wasn't your company that got breached, but it was your company's data that got breached. To respond to that.
That's great. Yeah, it's a great perspective, Brian. I think we've seen that over the years as things have evolved. We got a bad connection there.
You're at the mercy of the vendor, supplier, parts of the act. If you look at all the companies that have been hacked lately, everything from Target to even SolarWinds, the one common item is email, and someone clicked on something in email, and what happens when you click on something in email? You could get crypto locked, or your data could be held ransom, and we saw what that looked like too. Colonial Pipeline, Blackbaud. These are companies that got hacked. Their data was held, either was encrypted and held ransom, or it was held and threatened to be released to the public, and in return, people paid money. So, it's not a new concept. It is getting more attention. These organizations are more sophisticated. It's becoming more popular and lucrative. And yes, crime does pay, right? In these cases, insider threat. That's another area of concern. You have insiders. Insiders do things. It could be inadvertent or it could be intentional actions, and especially with those who have access to sensitive data or infrastructure. And there's we deal with that from time to time. We use, for example, Box for file sharing, and we leave it up to the end user. It's the end user's responsibility to share data in a responsible manner and to not store certain data at all. And sometimes people make mistakes. And then finally, I would say a denial of service is another security risk. Not necessarily relates to a breach, but if you can't access your data, if you can't access the applications that store your data, whether it's you or if your customers can't access your data, then that's a problem as well. So it's really around the CIA, right? The confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and infrastructure.
That's great, Brian. I appreciate the perspective, and it really, one of the things you said there really resonated with me as far as small and mid-sized companies not really having someone like you, or even being able to think about the broad range of threats there because they haven't experienced those things. And so it's I think the benefit of a systems provider, solution providers, is that having a broader perspective of the kinds of things that have been seen on different customers, and being able to then take that information and prepare your next customers for those same threats that they individually probably wouldn't have experienced or seen. So I think that's a great perspective on that. And I think that segues well into the next question that we have, which was, let's say you don't have the right security or protocols in place, and hackers get into your system. What are the most, you laid out some of the scenarios, but what are the most common things they could do with your data, as far as getting customer data, charging credit cards or ransomware or denial, or whatever it is? I'm curious what you've seen, maybe Vinay, on that front, and what the biggest threats are of actual usage of a successful attack.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. It's a great question. So, as you can tell, for several of us on the panel, we got a lot of these gray hairs. It comes from the wisdom and seeing these things and preventing them. So, I'm going to talk with you about some of the scenarios that are out there, but just rest assured, everyone on this panel has lots of controls in place so that these things don't happen. So I want to walk you through a few things, but I'll start with a security joke. It might actually be a dad joke, so you guys just be prepared. It may not be too funny, but there's a joke. Why do people rob banks? It's because that's where the money is. And really, if you think about security and hackers, ultimately they're actually after money. Now, if you watch like Ocean's 11, there's always like some fancy scenario. You got to break into this top secret vault in a casino. It's got electromagnetic locks, and then you got to sneak in a box and then get out past laser beams and drones. That stuff works in Hollywood, but that's actually not where the money is, and that's not what the bad guys are doing. So there are two types of actors you need to worry about. The first are kind of the amateurs. These are the high school kids or college kids, and they're just going after the small money. So like Bill mentioned, what they're after are credit card numbers. They will try to find credit card numbers if they're unencrypted. They'll break into an insecure system, get those things, and then your kind of threat level is maybe like $10,000 worth of losses. They'll try to get credit card numbers, buy a flat screen TV, or have like a kind of go on a binge in Vegas. And those aren't the guys you really need to worry about. It's the next set of kind of professional actors that you really need to worry about. Brian talked a little bit about this, and when you take over like a pipeline, these are concerted efforts, and there are two types of rogue actors you need to worry about. One, there are the cyber criminals that are kind of like the cyber crime professionals, and then the second are the nation states. So when you think of Russia, China, North Korea, some of the Eastern European communist countries, they're out there. And so they're targeting systems. What they're trying to do is ultimately get to a bank account or get to something like PayPal. And there are two ways to get the money. So first, they'll try to get your user ID password. They can buy things on the dark web. And, you get these sometimes from Gmail or Yahoo. Hey, there's been a compromise on emails, change your email. These things float out of the dark web, and people will buy user ID password and then try to use that not to get into your email, but to get into like your banking system or your financial software. And so you always want to make sure you're using different user IDs, different passwords across systems. You always want to have a strong second factor so that even if someone gets your credentials, you need to have something like a phone that they're texting to. Now, the ultimate goal is try to log in and test for bank accounts. You can either directly go to your bank, or you can test like a sign up flow in another SaaS offering and try to, most of us use like Plaid to connect your bank account. So they'll test credentials. It's called like credential stuffing. They bought a bunch of user ID passwords. They'll try it here and here. And what they're ultimately trying to do is get to a bank account, set up a way to actually move money out to a different account, kind of drain those funds and then move on. So ultimately, the bad guys are really after your money. So things like, social media, you want to just be careful about what you put out there. Because a lot of times through social engineering, they will try to get answers to your secret questions. Like, your mother's maiden name, how many kids you have, your first pet, your high school. These are all the things that they're looking for. So, the reason the bad guys are out there is they're after the money. Then they know that we're all actually kind of working from home, and the defenses are down a little bit. So they try to go after these other systems to really go after the money. So there are no Ocean's 11 sequels out there in the security world. It's the stuff that you read about that you're wondering, like like the SolarWinds stuff. How did that happen? But it's all in the digital front there.
That's great perspective, Vinay. Anyone else want to add anything on top of that?
I'll add one thing.
Yeah.
You know, with some people hack to get credit cards. I think about Intacct. Of course, I think about Intacct all the time. That's my job. And you don't necessarily need to have credit cards to make money. You know, for example, you know, we have a lot of publicly traded companies that use Intacct. And you know, I always think about what if what if I was a hacker? What would I do if I had access to Intacct data?
Team, I'm going to text Brian and let him know that we're having some audio issues.
All right.
And what I
Well, hey Brian, I think we're having some audio issues on your side. I'm going to try to
I would do
try to figure that out and probably move on to the next question while we're figuring that out.
I want some sort of authorized access and equal 100,200.
Oh, who's Brian? Oh, there you are. Sorry, Brian, you were breaking up quite a bit there.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Internet connection must be a little shoddy. I'm not sure where I dropped, but what I want, just to finish my comment, was that, you know, financial systems include Intacct many times have information on publicly traded companies, and if you know at the end of a quarter that a company is going to make their numbers, well, you can log into your brokerage account and you can make some stock trades, especially options trades, and you can make a lot of money. You know, and I think about that, and amongst a lot of other things, but that's kind of one of the, you know, the scenarios that I like to paint in regards to what does it mean for unauthorized access.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, and I think we certainly see a wide range of things, and I know, you know, as a company ourselves, you know, there's the how are our customers trying to protect their data, and what security protocols do they have around their systems that they manage, and then there's, you know, how do we leverage the capabilities in the applications that we use to deliver services like Bill.com and like Sage Intacct. And then there's separately, you know, when there is if a customer, for instance, has been breached, not through even one of these systems, but someone may have, as you pointed out, Brian, gotten into their email server and done something, and they have been breached. You know, we talk a lot about what protocols we need to have in place to minimize the damage that could be done given that one of our customers has been breached on one of their systems. And so maybe, Jeanine, it would be a good question for you, but, you know, we're all here to prevent a breach from happening. But if there is one, what are examples maybe of some of the things that people can do, companies can do to protect themselves and minimize the potential damage of a breach?
Yep. Yeah, so, you know, I think, Bill, you know, I'm a pretty big sports fan, so the best defense is a good offense. And so having some protocols in place that kind of almost always assume there's a breach, because like Vinay said, it's not Hollywood. And when there's a breach, you don't have lights and sirens going off saying, woohoo, woohoo, you know, somebody's breached the perimeter. So we have some protocols where if something is looking like it's going outside of the standard process, you usually follow up with like a phone call. So we had an example a couple years ago where one of our clients, their email was hacked, and they started sending email requests that looked very much like they were coming from the company CFO and the company VP of marketing, asking our team to hurry up and wire money out because they wanted to get going with a new vendor. And they were smart. They did it around the holidays when a lot of people weren't in the office. And that wasn't our standard process for releasing funds to a vendor. So we reached out and made a phone call and called each of the parties that were supposedly sending emails, and they both said, nope, I didn't send that. So didn't obviously follow through, didn't send the wire, and then immediately notified IT to say, okay, there's been a compromise here. Other examples, again, include phoning up a vendor. So you might get an email, hey, can you change my ACH instructions or my wiring instructions? Well, that can very easily be an email hack that they can look like a vendor. And so what we do is say, okay, our team, look at the most recent bill that actually was received and paid, call up the vendor using the phone number on that bill, and ask a few qualifying questions. What was the last invoice number you received payment from us, or what was the amount you received payment? Something to validate that that person is legit on the other side before you kind of go ahead and just trust an email that you receive, because you don't know if it's been compromised or not.
Yep, that's a great perspective, Jeanine, and it's one certainly I worry about quite a bit. Right, is how do we make sure we have the right protocols to help our customers avoid those situations? And I thought your examples were great, Jeanine, as well as like you said, different ways people from phishing, the generic attempts to try to get money, or to someone has successfully hacked in and now they have information where they would try to be able to say, oh, we know an invoice number or something like that, where that phone call really separates the action of the responding to the request to reaching out to the named person from that vendor with their contact information. And I think that's a great one we've certainly seen be successful in squashing attempts to steal money from customers. I think that segues well into the next question. How do we, how as a system provider, and Vinay, I think this would be a good question for you. How do you ensure that you don't release and expose your customer information? How do you build protocols that your customers into your products that allow your customers to safeguard their money?
Yeah, great, Bill. Great question, and it's kind of building on what Jeanine talked about. That you want to make sure that you get those alerts. They're not going to be these big flashing alerts, but when we build software at Build.com, we engineer security in from the beginning. So, for example, the scenarios that Jeanine talked about, I have a training. I take every new employee in their first 30 days through security training, and I talk about some of these social engineering scenarios to avoid. Now, at the same time, you can't ever assume that you train everyone. You have to build a product securely from the beginning, because honestly, we take data stewardship very seriously. It's like companies that when they come to us, they trust us with their financial data, with their payments, their AP, their AR. And so, on any given day, we have lots of sensitive data. We're taking care of their processes. So we take that very seriously. It's a lot of responsibility, and we never want to be in the news for that. We want to be in the news for press releases and new product features, but never that. And then anytime, our CEO, Renee, is on the CNBC, I know that it's like a big bullseye that's on our back. So we're, always vigilant. So there are two security principles we start with. The first one is called defense in depth, and then the second one is called zero trust. And I'll relate this in a way that we can kind of all think about this. So we've got a house, and you got a front door and you got a back door. So on your front door, you probably got a deadbolt there. You got a little peephole to see who's out the door. Probably got a security system. Backyard is also where you need to be more careful. You've got a yard. You probably have a fence around it. Maybe some lights with motion sensors. Maybe a camera, tied to your security system, as well as locks on the perimeter. So there are different ways that you layer in security to make sure that you've got lots of different defenses on your house. And it's the same thing that we bake in to the software. So we have firewalls out there that are always on guard, on the public facing internet. So, on any given month, we're blocking, tens of thousands of attempts. And they never get through. We look for suspicious IP addresses, and they're out there. They'll probably, every time they hear about whether it's Intacct or Build.com or Consero, that's when it's like, okay, that's where the money is, right? So So we've got firewalls, but we have lots of compensating controls. You have to assume that, you want to limit any kind of blast radius. If they get through one defense, you got the next one. So data is always encrypted when it's in transit, when it's at rest. Even if they got to your database, guess what? It's like, oh, I can't read any of this data. It's fully encrypted. The encryption keys are somewhere else. So you're always layering in these different defenses to make sure that if they ever got through one layer, you got the next safeguard at the next layer. Now, just like Jeanine talked about, we are testing, so we use tools throughout the process. We review our code. We actually have penetration testing. We actually get the security researchers out there to look for vulnerabilities in our software. If they find one, they report it, and we pay a bug bounty and we fix it right away. So we got multiple layers of technology and people that are doing this. Now, the second principle I talked about is zero trust. And I'm going to go back to our home example. So you get someone at the front door, you look through the little people, oh, it's your mom and dad. Okay, so you let them in, you trust them. You're going to let them have free range around your house while you're in the kitchen getting them something to drink. You're probably worried that they're going to judge you like, hey, Vinay, you got too much dust on the coffee table, clean that up. What are you doing? So, but you trust that, they've got free access to the house. Maybe one of your kids' friends shows up, you haven't met them, you let them in, but you don't let them all the way into your house. And then if you got someone trying to sell you something, maybe you don't let them in at all. So instead of trust but verify, you really start off with verify and then trust. So what you do is you're going to have a strong user ID and password. You actually might have some requirements on passwords like special characters, and maybe you need to rotate the password every now and then. It's kind of a pain, but really some of that stuff works really well. It keeps you from having the same password as your email. You will require a second factor. So that way, if you're on vacation, in France, and then you log in, we're like, I don't recognize, is that Vinay? Let's send him a text and verify that's him. Oh, yep, that's him. But maybe we got a login on my account from Estonia. By the way, this did happen, so we block that because we know it's the verify and then trust. And then once you're in the system, you have various levels of access. You have roles and permissions. Maybe Vinay is an admin user and can do more stuff. And maybe Brian is a user on his account but can only do approvals. And so all of these different things, it's really about, first verify the identity. Based on the identity, they only have certain access to the system. And so it really goes back to those principles of limiting blast radius, making sure you know who's in there, and keeping very strong audit controls throughout the process. So unfortunately, I'm never going to make an Ocean 11 sequel. Probably not going to act in one, but it's all good. We're keeping everything safe here in the software.
That's great. That's great. Great perspective, Vinay. I think about what you said too in terms of the layers and the verify and then trust. And I think about even Jeanine, and you know this as you've set many of these up, is the way even for us, segregation of duties being an important part, not just from the perspective of the internal person, a threat of an internal person doing something, but the idea of, for instance, with vendors, if there's updating vendor payment information, if you have everybody on our service teams who could do that for a customer, it's hard to make sure they all know how to handle the exception case and they know how to do it well. So we route that to a group who specializes in that, and they know the protocol that has to be followed. So you don't have a slip where somebody just forgot because they don't deal with that very often. And so, that segregation of duties and having specialization to deal with exceptions that are threats, those are the things where you can do similar things for making sure those people know how to verify before they take an action. So I think that's really pointed, Vinay. I'd ask another question here, and I don't know if this would be a better one for Vinay or Brian, but how should audiences, the folks in the audience, how should they defend themselves? We talked a lot about how you guys build security into your products, but no doubt every company is different, but what are the key themes around securing their finance function from from breaches. I don't know, Vinay, if you want to handle that, or Brian, you want to take that, or if you both might have a perspective there.
I could take a first shot at that, and I typically talk about the concept of the shared responsibility model. There's things that are in your control, and there's things that you're not in your control. What's not in your control is the responsibility of your service provider, or whether it's your software as a, excuse me, your software as a service provider or your internet service provider. There's certain things that they're responsible for, whether where their infrastructure lives, the security of their data center, how they segment your data, the firewalls that they use, the configuration of the servers and the infrastructure, the security of the application, what's monitored, how encryption, audit and compliance, right? There's disaster recovery, backups. Those are all things that you really don't have a lot of control over. You just have to trust that the provider is doing that stuff, but also try to understand what the response that you have, and I call them user entity controls, specifically around security, which is things like multi-factor authentication or session timeouts, the various options for passwords, password length, password complexity, how many times before the password gets locked out, how many of your previous passwords can you reuse, support for single sign-on, roles and permissions, logging, and most importantly, it's your responsibility to review, right? It's not going to be like an Intacct. We're not going to review your company's roles and permissions and the users. It's your responsibility. If someone leaves your company, you have to disable their account. If someone changes roles, changes a role in the company, you have to adjust the roles and permissions accordingly. You have to monitor your logs. You have to fill in the blank. That's your responsibility. So that's my advice, is to understand what options you have in the application, whether it's Intacct or whether it's Salesforce or whether it's Marketo, whatever the business application is, or even your email. I mean, we were talking earlier about business email compromise. I see that all the time. A lot of our customers, they blame us. They think it's us. So the Intacct system is sending an email. Intacct has been compromised. Well, no, it's not. Your email got hacked, and the hacker used that, studied your email, and social engineered recipients or other folks in your organization to think that the email came from you, when really it didn't. It was generated by the hacker, because the hacker has access. And why? Because you don't have multi-factor authentication enabled for your email. If you're just using a username and password, which I see in every one of the business email compromises I've been engaged with, and there's a lot, there's one thing in common: they didn't have multi-factor authentication for access to email. And number one, and number two, they use the same password. And a lot of times people use the same password for many different business applications, and you can't do that. That's why multi-factor authentication or single sign-on with multi-factor authentication is really important.
That's awesome, Brian. That's great synopsis.
Yeah. Bill could add a couple of things to that. So, Brian talked a lot about business email compromise, and then, Jeanine talked about trying to impersonate the CFO or CEO. It's like, well, Vinay is doing a great job on this webinar. Send him $1 million right now. I teach people in the new employee boot camp. You will never get an email like that from our CEO or CFO. There's never going to be a "gotta do this today, change this bank account, change this wiring." So you have to get people, thinking about that. The other thing that we have is, and this is the counterintuitive part, but the cloud is actually more secure than your desktop, because the controls that we've put in place into all of our applications. I can speak for Bill.com. We get audited by 5 banks every year. They come on site, they review our data centers, they do their own pen tests. We've got a bunch of things we have to comply to, like security standards, GDPR, CCPA, and these things all test for different controls we have in place. So the cloud is actually very secure. The thing that I teach folks in the new employee boot camp is where you get into trouble is, you have to analyze customer data. Sometimes you're doing financials. Don't leave that Excel file on your laptop. We encourage everyone to use Office 365 or Google Docs. Put your data in the cloud, because we've got strong second factor and all that. We use Okta for all of our business apps. So even if someone's user ID password got compromised, we've got a strong second factor that is required before you can get into any of our back office, even our own internal back office. So that's actually a great takeaway everyone on this call should do, is think about your own back office and talk to your IT folks and think about how you can get single sign-on in place. There are lots of tools out there. Okta is one that we use, and it's great. And so then it really controls, if you've got an employee, he leaves, you can turn them off in one place. And then they instantly lose access to all of your back office stuff. So there are some really good security practices out there. But the real takeaway is the cloud is very secure. You can put in strong compensating controls, and just make sure you can remotely wipe your laptops for all your employees. They do get stolen or misplaced. You can wipe that data right away and limit any damage.
That's great. I think both you guys, Vinay and Brian, those are great points around the how people can be doing things, and the tools having capabilities to allow them to do it. But like you said, Brian, the companies have to take advantage of the capabilities in the applications to optimally protect themselves. And I know that's something that I think we've certainly embraced, and as a provider that we believe one of the advantages we can offer is we know the tools very well, because we use them on so many clients, and we try to use them in very consistent ways. And so knowing those capabilities, we feel like we can take advantage of those on a more consistent basis of the great features that are built in there, and make sure we're doing that well and consistently. So that kind of brings me, Jeanine, to over the years, a lot of the technology has simplified and kind of improved our ability to maintain good internal controls in the F&A functions that we're running for our customers. Maybe you could talk a little more about that, like how a bill.com, which allows for automated and electronic approval routing, how we can, how that benefits us versus paper-based signatures and things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know how many times I wished we had bill.com earlier in my career. So Vinay, I have a beef with you why y'all couldn't, have this in the late 90s, early 2000s. You would have made my life a lot easier. You're talking about, I'm sitting on the L train going home and attaching paper, templates to every bill and writing out who needs to approve it. These papers are being walked around the office for just anybody to sign, and nobody has a signature that's legible, but you have to go through the process. And so it'd been very easy for somebody else to have just, put something in there, signed it, think, oh, I missed keying this in the first time, I'll go ahead and key it in, right? So having a technology that just allows you to have all that happen, automatically, with the right permissioning and controls with the roles, as you had talked to earlier. And then even on the bill pay side of it. So again, same time, I do my check runs a couple times a week, and inevitably our controller would get tied up, and he would say, okay, I don't have time to sign these today, let's go ahead and lock them up. And the lock in the cabinet, it wasn't the, vault at the Bellagio, and he had a stamp check signer with his signature on a stamper. So, you just break that lock, and somebody could have very easily, gotten some blank check stock out, stamped it, wrote something out to their own, to cash, and there you go. They walk off with a couple $100,000. But not having that anymore makes it a lot easier to prevent, some of those just very easy opportunistic, You know, those are more of like coming from people that may not be the grand master behind coming up with these big scams, but they find an opportunity and so they take advantage of it. They're like, oh, this is relatively easy. I need some money to pay my rent this month. I'll just go ahead and do it. You know, what's the worst that can happen? So thankfully for, you know, companies like Bill.com and Intacct and all of the others out there, you know, that has really minimized the risk of those types of fraudulent events from occurring.
That's great, Jeanine.
Yes.
Good perspective. I know we've got it's about 15 minutes left. I don't know, Bridget, did we want to? We had a couple of questions, but I also wanted to make sure we save time for any questions that had come up. Do we want to? I don't know what you think timing wise.
Yeah, we've got we do have one question that's been has been asked in the Q&A. It's kind of been answered by Brian, so maybe I'll take this over to Vinay. The question is, I saw a recent survey where 91% of respondents claim to understand the risks of reusing passwords across multiple accounts, but 59 admitted to doing it anyway, and the compromised passwords are responsible for up to the majority of hacking-related breaches. What role should the password play in a company's omni-channel security strategy, and what is your opinion on password-less authentication?
Yes. So I'll take the first part of that question. So the reality is, passwords do get reused, and user IDs do get reused across apps. And you know, it's a fact of sort of human nature that happens. So we assume that that's going to happen, and that's why we really require a second factor. You know, so assume that someone does get a hold of user ID and password. They're usually doing it on a different device somewhere else. And if we don't recognize that device, we have strong fingerprinting. We'll use that second factor. So that's an out-of-band approval. So, you know, the thing with second factor and authentication is you have something, you know, your user ID and password, and something you have. And that is the device that we have put a strong, you know, encryption token on. So we know that is Bridget's device. And so if we get a login, maybe you're in Italy, and we'll ask for that second factor, we will verify that. So you always have that compensating control. The neat thing is there are a lot of advances in the security community about going to basically getting rid of user IDs and passwords entirely. Where, for example, when you log in, it can send you a request to that strong second factor to authenticate. I'm not a big fan of sending an email to have you log in, because you have to assume the email itself might be compromised. So I know, like, if you've got a blog on Medium, a lot of times you go log into your account and they'll send you an email to verify. That is good for like a blog post. It is awful for financial applications. So we will never do that. There's a lot of advancements in biometrics and things. So for example, on our Bill.com mobile app on the iPhone, you can actually set up Face ID. So you log in once with your user ID password, we will authenticate that with a second factor. And then you can say, okay, oh, it's Vinay. Oh, guess what? He's wearing a goatee now. I still recognize him, and then it logs you in. So that is a strong, biometrics are always really secure. So I do believe that, especially on mobile devices, you should try to use biometrics as much as possible. Face ID, Touch ID, super secure.
That's actually great. I think that's super interesting. Like we've got where things have evolved to today, where we've added, security that wasn't there before. And then that's, some of the stuff that's going to be more in the future. And it kind of segues me, Brian, to, and Vinay had touched on this earlier a little bit about, with so much of the data being in the cloud, there are things you can do native to the application of what he just brought up. And he touched briefly before on the cloud being more secure, but maybe you could talk a little bit from your perspective. How do we secure the cloud? The accessibility and ease of these cloud applications are kind of the exact qualities that we like about it, but are also the ones that seem to make the cloud have some vulnerability because you want to make it easy and accessible. Maybe you could talk a little about how you balance that and how you protect the data while still making it accessible to everybody.
Yeah, I reflect back on my previous comment that I made to a previous question regarding that shared responsibility model. And, you know, we, in regards to Intacct's responsibility, we take, you know, as anyone on this call would probably say, we take security seriously, and we truly do. And we have, you know, we spend a lot of time ensuring that the infrastructure that the application lives on, because in a cloud-based application, whether it's cloud-based or whether it's traditional on-prem, you still have infrastructure. In our case, you know, our infrastructure is both on-prem in a data center, and it's also in AWS, because we now have, if most people on the call know, Intacct is now deployed into AWS to accommodate some international growth. So we have infrastructure in Australia and Dublin and in Montreal, Canada. So for customers who have various levels of either it's paranoia or regulatory restrictions to keep data, we have our infrastructure in AWS. So what does that mean? We've got servers, the same types of servers that we have in our data center live in AWS, and we spent a lot of time locking those servers down, which it's not your run-of-the-mill deployment of Linux or Oracle or Apache. It's hardened, and we've got significant amounts of both data and network segmentation in place. And we have that audited. We bring in third parties. We also, similar to Bill.com, you know, we also have an ongoing bug bounty program where hackers are invited to hack us and let us know what they find. And if they find something really interesting, we'll pay them some money. And we also bring in other third parties on a regular basis to test, you know, overall or specific areas. I call it surgical penetration testing, where they focus on just one area of our application, maybe just the API, or maybe just the journal ledger module or the fixed assets module. And so it's constant attention. You know, one of my flaws, I have many security flaws. One of them is that security is a process. It's not go out and buy this piece of software, install it, and be secure. It's constant, because the landscape is always changing. The hackers are always finding holes and ways to get in. And why? Because that's how they make money, and that's how they gain notoriety. So we have to constantly be on top of the game. And it's and I feel that is Intacct 100% secure? I don't think so. There's always I don't think anyone's ever 100%, but I feel that at least for the Intacct security program, that we have enough controls in place that if something were to happen, that we would have visibility to that, and we have enough processes in place that if something did happen, that we would be able to respond and react accordingly. So again, it's just a matter of the concept of defense in depth and audit and compliance and security, and recognize one of my other philosophies is that compliance doesn't equal security. Just because you're PCI or HIPAA or SOC 1, SOC 2, GDPR, ISO, doesn't mean you're secure. And we use compliance as a way to validate, and also of course as a marketing and sales enablement tool. But I put security on top of compliance.
Yep, that's a great point. I know, Jeanine, that's near and dear to your heart, is how to marry up the process with, again, the system capabilities. And I think about I'll ask you, if there are, we've talked about a couple of those things already, but I hearken back to a saying I've heard before, and I thought about this with not even just cybersecurity, but internal threats, is the number of small and mid-sized companies who are victims of financial fraud, whether that's cybercrime or internal people who do things they shouldn't do. And I know somebody I've been friends with for a long time, and he had a company where that happened to them, and he said to me, I think you guys really undersell the value it brings to have separation from the business and the controls that you've natively built in to protect the business against fraud. And one of the things I told him was, I think your perception might be we undersell it, because when we do talk about it, most people just don't think it's going to happen to them. You know, they go, oh, you know, it's important to my friend because he's been a victim, right? And so now, you know, it's the old saying that people are best convinced by those things they discover for themselves. And now you consider it a real threat. But I know, Jeanine, you take a lot of pride in the things we build into the process based on things maybe we've seen, but each customer doesn't have to experience those things to get the benefits of what has been seen out there, either what Sage, Intacct, and Bill.com build into their systems, or to what we, you know, are enacting process-wise. But I don't know if you had any other things around.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think the segregation of duties, I know you had mentioned that earlier, but that is hard for something in a small company to do because they just don't necessarily have the resources. But there's a reason that is really important, because having the same person that's, you know, entering the AP bill, paying the AP bill, and then reconciling the cash is, you know, just the trifecta for committing fraud and being able to cover it up. Until, you know, there's a reason for somebody to start digging, like, why am I losing money? And in a lot of cases, that can be several years after the fact, and maybe that employee is gone. And a lot of times that happens because they put somebody in that role that's somebody they trust. A lot of times when companies are just starting out, they pull in like their neighbor that they've known for 20 years who's done some bookkeeping work, right? And so they look at it as, oh, you know, Joe Schmo would never do that to me. We're neighbors, we're friends. And so we look at it as, you know, we have to look at it more as the position and not the person. And it's not personal against that person, but, you know, you have to put those controls in place. And Vinay, this goes, you know, to what you're saying is the verify first, you know, and then trust. And then you look at me and I'm like, trust no one, because you can't, you never know. You know, you've seen family members do it to each other. So you have to look at it and almost put the controls in place and kind of assume that somebody is going to try to, you know, purchase things on the corporate credit card when they're not supposed to, or write themselves a check to cover their rent for the month because they're a little bit tight because they lost too much in Vegas that weekend. And, you know, you have to kind of put the process and the segregation of duties and the checks and balances in place, assuming that it's going to happen. And if you structure it that way, you know, and it never happens, great, no harm, no foul. But if it does, you're going to catch it and catch it quick and prevent, you know, something from becoming catastrophic that you can't recover from.
That's great. Yeah, and I wondered, Jeanine, do you think that the trust no one, do you think that comes from your background as a controller, or that you're from Chicago originally?
Probably Chicago thing first, yes.
But Jeanine, that is a great principle of trust no one and assume that you're always, you know, on the lookout for fraud. And the nice thing is, in our system, we have fraud controls in place. So we've got a bunch of AI and machine learning tools that are looking at transactions and saying, hey, that's a suspicious transaction. Let's hold that aside and then get a secondary approval from the admin on that account. So it goes back to the, you know, zero trust, and then the defense in depth that we've got compensating controls in place to, you know, safeguard you as well.
And a good example too, Vinay, to what you talked about earlier, of having the layers, right? You're protecting here, you got something here, and then all the way through the release of the payment. I think that's a great point. I think we might be running up against time here.
We
Bridget.
are. We're out of questions, and I think I'd like to see all of the four of you get together and do Ocean's 14 out of Chicago. I think it'd be a great movie. Great suggestion, Vinay.
Yeah, we'll have to do something on the L train.
Thank you all very much for your time, your expertise, and contribution to the discussion. A lot of valuable information for the audience that attended today. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
talk to you soon.
Great job, guys.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Right.